Welcome to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Here are your hosts, Anthony and Melissa.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. I'm your host, Anthony.
I'm Melissa.
We're so glad that you're here tonight. Tonight, we have a very, I would say, unique episode planned for you. It's one that comes from a listener letter from an atheist, actually, who was very polite and wrote in and asked us to contrast mental illness versus demonic possession. And because we always try to be educational on this program, as well as to help people out through prayer and just kind of being empathetic to their situation, we don't mind taking the time on an episode every now and then to be a little more educational. And so what we're going to do is cover some, I would say, theology as well as theoretical orientation when it comes to mental illness and how that sometimes relates to and how sometimes that's opposed to demonic possession. So before we get to that, we just have a couple of announcements. So as far as announcements go, we just want to keep it very simple today. We just want to remind you that we do have a second podcast that is called the Struggle Series podcast. And that's where you can listen to my book trilogy entitled, of course, the Struggle Series. And right now, if you were to tune in, you can listen to all of book one entitled The Struggle, as well as almost all of book two entitled The Sacrifice. I think you can probably get up to episode 12 or 13, depending on when you find this podcast next week. And so we wanted to remind you to check that out. We get a lot of correspondence about where can you find our books and that type of thing. But we decided a while back that at least the first two books we wanted to get out in a podcast format, in just kind of a narrative format, because, you know, I'm not really interested in making all the book money anymore. I wanted to make sure that it's out there because it does correspond with a lot of the theology that we talk about here. And those books are basically following the escapades of a crazy out-of-the-box pastor who does deliverance ministry and goes out to help people in need. And the books are very much also considered what would be a thriller or a crime novel wrapped up in a horror novel, wrapped up with a bunch of Christian theology. So they're very entertaining, a lot of big twists and turns, and definitely big, shocking endings to all three of those books. So if that's something that interests you, make sure you tune into that. Those are free. You could find those wherever you listen to your podcast, same place that you found this, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon. They're out there. It's once again entitled the Struggle Series podcast. You can also find us on the socials. We would love for you to join on there. And that's one of the ways you can contact us. If you have a story of your own, you can DM us there, or you could reach out to us at anthony@thestruggleseries.com. And we will entertain all of your stories. And if you're somebody who wants to do an interview or have your letter or request read on the air, you can just note that in your email or in your DM. And we would love to reach out to you and make sure that that's something that you want to be aired. And then we'll put it on the podcast if we think it's something that can help you as well as help others. We also want to remind you of our Patreon campaign. And at the $2 level on Patreon, you can get all of the bonus episode. All of the episodes one day early, as well as it just kind of contributes to the overall functioning of the podcast. At the $5 level, you get access to all of the bonus episodes, as well as the podcast one day early, as well as the entire narrative copies of all three of the books, The Struggle, The Sacrifice, and The Return, which hasn't even been released
I'm excited for that one.
in book format. And so those are all available there. So for $5, you have access to 3 novels. And so if that's something that interests you, also be reminded that when you sign up for Patreon, there is a free 7-day trial. So you can see if that's something you want to get into before you contribute. And we hope you stick around after that. So with that being said, let's get to this podcast today. And Melissa, it's one that you and I talk about a lot, and we've had a lot of conversations about. And so we thought it was time to maybe get to this letter, because it not only answers this gentleman's question, but it definitely maybe answers a lot of questions for a lot of you listeners who maybe aren't necessarily Christians or you don't necessarily believe that Christian theology
Mm-hmm.
always ties into the paranormal.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we've entitled this episode Mental Illness versus Demonic Possession. And so let's get to this letter and then let's just jump into it because
Okay.
it's very brief.
Yeah.
It says, "Hey, Anthony, just wanted to ask you a serious question. I will start out by saying that I am an atheist and I don't believe in any of the stuff you're saying." Well, at least he's honest, right? And I actually chose to read this
The
letter,
first
believe
two
it or not,
sentences.
is because he was polite. I don't
Yeah.
expect atheists or non-believers to believe what we say because we said it, but we just love the politeness versus a lot of the malicious attacks that we normally get. So I applaud his I would say almost professionalism in his questioning. But he says, "I came across your channel from a TikTok video that I saw." And we do put out some TikTok videos just to kind of promote each episode, as well as, we promote a lot of other paranormal channels and things on our TikTok. So if that's something that you're interested, you could find us there. I think it's FFTS podcast on TikTok as well. And he said, "I came across a TikTok video and I did listen to the entire episode about a man named Kurt who you spoke of." So Kurt was actually, I think, season one, episode one.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a crazy episode. I would definitely listen to that one. That's one of our favorites.
No, season 3.
I'm sorry, season
one.
3, episode 1.
Yeah.
Thanks for correcting me there because
Yeah.
I get ahead of myself. And then this gentleman goes on to say, "I have to admit that I appreciated the fact that you were not afraid to confront religion." And what I would say to that is, I don't ever want to come across, and we don't want to be people that are religion bashers, or we want the atheists to be happy with us, so we confront religion. But in that case, I think confrontation was necessary.
Yeah, exactly.
From what I remember of that. And so this gentleman, I just want you to know that, yes, we are not afraid to confront religion. However, we are definitely Christian and Bible based here. So hopefully if you, can continue to listen, then maybe, you'll understand that we're coming at this maybe from a different place than you think most Christians do. But let's continue. "Rather than be confrontational, I wanted to just ask a serious question. What are your thoughts on all of these claims of demonic possession being mental illness? Could you expand on your experience or background with mental illness versus the perception of demonic possession?" So I like the word perception there. That's the loaded part of the letter, but I definitely appreciate the politeness. And so I will overlook that one little word there. That was the jab, I think. But it says, "I politely ask that you address this on one of your upcoming shows. Also, would you please email me and let me know if you're going to address this so I can tune in? Thank you so much for considering my request. Sincerely, Baxter." Okay, Baxter, I am going to send you an email to let you know that we're actually going to air this episode and when it's going to come out. And I do want to let most people know that I don't normally let people hold me hostage like that, but you can understand what he's saying. And Baxter, we're having fun at your expense, and hopefully you let the humor really not
Yeah,
be.
exactly.
We're just trying to keep this light because
yes.
Trust me, my friend, we get some nasty correspondence from non-believers. And so therefore, I absolutely 100% with all sincerity applaud your professionalism.
Yes.
With that being said, though, you are definitely showing us that you're not going to listen anymore until, I tell you when to listen. But I am going to take that bait because hopefully if you do listen to this episode, you will understand a little more about where we come from. And maybe if I'm honest with you, and I'll be honest right out of the gate, that it will help you with your bias against us. Because I think what we want to start with is this. There is a lot of bias towards Christians that I think is warranted. When Melissa, when I hear, and I've heard this for decades and decades as a minister, what about the Crusades? Like, well, yeah, the church has done some horrible things. And so I can't really back that.
Right.
I can't say, yeah, it was a good idea for Queen Isabella to send all these guys to the New World and say, either make them Catholic or we're going to kill you. Like, I can't back that. but I don't know if that was in the name of God. I would say, in my opinion, it absolutely wasn't. It was in the name of the church, but
Right.
it wasn't in the name of God. They may have used the word God, but that was pretty dark times in the church's history.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't back that. So a bias towards the Crusades, I'm with you. It almost makes me ashamed sometimes to be called a Christian because of the Crusades.
Right.
However, there's a lot of bias towards Christians that is unwarranted based off of, I would say, either a misperception or just a flat out refusal to understand where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another good one. Um, that people, there's a bias that, sometimes I struggle with and sometimes I don't. Well, all Christians do is ask you for money. That's not true.
That's not true.
That's not true at all. Now, I shouldn't say at all, but that's not true most of the time. There are some churches you can go to that if you don't tithe, they are going to break you down.
Oh yeah.
But most churches just say, here's why we tithe, and if you can, and then they might pass the plate in front of you. Well, if it doesn't bother you, just let it pass you.
Yeah.
If it's
exactly.
bothering you and driving you crazy, then maybe that's something more internal in you.
Mm-hmm.
But the bias then becomes all they do is ask for money. And of course, like if you go back to the old days, I don't know how old you are, Baxter, but there was some of those televangelists that were,
Oh
that
yeah. I
was that
remember
was that
those.
baker guy that had like
Uh-huh.
a air conditioned
Shouldn't-
doghouse and stuff like
Mhm.
that. Yeah, that guy's a clown. But I mean, as far as I know, he repented of that too. But he caused a big disservice to the church, global church, by being, money hungry. But on the same token, most local churches, that's how they
That's how they
that's
operate
how
and
they
run.
survive, my friend.
Yeah.
They don't sell products. They
Mm-hmm.
don't have they might sell CDs of their sermons, or maybe one of the pastors wrote a book and
Mm-hmm.
some of the proceeds go to the ministry, but they don't sell widgets and that you can go buy, and then they're also asking you for money on top of it. These ministers have chosen to give up pieces of their lives, and even, more than you can imagine, the abuse that they take
Mm-hmm.
in something they believe. And of course, I can speak as a minister. I never really got over that hump. Anytime we had to do sermon series about money, I hated it,
Mm-hmm.
because not because I don't believe that the Bible, gives us reasons to do so, or that I understand how a church functions. I just knew that there was people in the audience that believed in that bias, that were going to judge us
Mm-hmm.
for asking. And so that's one that's kind of in the middle. And then, of course, maybe a bias that's completely and utterly, probably the vast majority of the time not true, is that Christians are always sticking their religion in my face. Now,
Yeah.
am I saying that's 100% the other way? No, there are Christians that'll see you and go, "Hey, you stranger, do you know about Jesus? Why don't you worship Jesus?" Those people exist. Most of the time when Christianity's in your face, it's because it's part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I ignore a lot of things that I don't like. And so if somebody's shoving it down your throat, Baxter, I'm sorry. You might be right if that was your bias. I'm not saying it is. But if somebody is celebrating Christmas, which by the way isn't even Jesus's birthday, that's just the day that history has kind of evolved to where we celebrate Jesus's birthday. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
any real Christians believe that Jesus was actually born on December 25th.
I wonder if a lot of people even know that.
They
They
probably
probably
don't.
don't. Like if
But if I
just
don't have a
assume.
right to celebrate the birth of my Savior,
Mm-hmm.
who I strongly believe in, because you don't like that it's in your culture, well, I can assure you that I can find many things that are also in this same culture that I do not approve of.
Mm-hmm.
And and the difference is that that would be considered proselytizing as well. So I'll give you an example. I saw a shirt the other day, and it kind of caught me off guard. And I bet you it wouldn't have caught you off guard. It said, "Believe in yourself, and anything and any other beliefs you have that are not for you and you alone get rid of. And I'm paraphrasing. So what it said is only believe in yourself, and anything contrary to what you already believe, get rid of.
Huh.
Now, you have to understand how contrary that is to our belief system.
Mm-hmm.
That in my belief system, I know I'm a dirtbag and I've made several mistakes and I have this sin nature, but I have this God who loves me and told me that if I do things his way, life gets easier because I keep chasing the wrong paths and the wrong avenues. So I learned to kind of die to myself
Mm-hmm.
and trust him. That shirt is very contrary to that. So I can assure you that shirt wasn't written by a Christian. And more importantly, I assure you that shirt was written towards religion.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is proselytizing to me. So
Mm-hmm.
if an atheist gets mad, and you should see the graphic tees that I wear. I love to wear graphic tees that have little religious messages. And I've been yelled at the post office. I've been
Oh
yelled
yeah.
at the tire store. I've been yelled at Walmart. People just want to chase me down and, tell me to stick my Jesus, where. But when that person, that shirt that I saw, all I did was say, well, I'm going to pray for that guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't tell him I was going to pray for him. I didn't stop him and say,
Oh, this was on someone that
this
you
was on
just saw walking down the street,
on a
not
shirt.
hanging
Yeah.
up in the store for sale.
No, it was on.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't stop him and harass him. And I simply just vowed to pray for that person. And so I'm saying all this about biases, which doesn't really have a lot to do with your letter, because I really want you to, if you'll do me a favor, Baxter, Melissa and I today are going to break down this topic. And I want you to try to at least set that bias aside. And you may or may not believe you have a bias, but you do. And that would be like me saying that I don't have a bias against atheists. And my bias may not be as big as the next Christians, but I have to admit that I have them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so let's set those aside and let's literally have a talk. And for you, Baxter, and you alone, I am not going to open the Bible today. Not that I'm ashamed of it, and not that I may not hint about it throughout this conversation. I'm actually going to take you to the DSM-5, which is where mental health diagnoses are derived from. And I would imagine you're a smart guy and you may have heard that, but if you haven't, or for the listeners who haven't, there's this book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that all therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, licensed therapists use to diagnose mental health issues. So I've even heard therapists say that this is our Bible. I don't like that, but I've heard people say that. So instead of me digging into the Bible, I'm going to maybe take you in a different direction than you thought I would. So before Melissa and I get to this, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, because I'll bet you if you've only heard one message, you're not really sure who I am.
Yeah, I really enjoy the episodes that we do. Well, I enjoy all of them, but most like the ones that you educate us, on the therapist side and also the religious side, like how it combines, or it could combine together. So I'm excited about this episode.
Well,
so
cool.
Let's get started.
Let's do it.
Ready to learn something.
Okay, so Baxter,
Something new.
I come from a background where I am bivocational. And what that means, if you don't understand, not you or any listeners, that I am trained in two different vocations that I worked at the same time. So I spent a lot of my life in college, 13 years after high school. And I'm still paying off the student loans for that, even though I'm an old man. Because when you have a PhD, master's and bachelor's degrees and all that stuff, it adds up. But I was trained in the ministry as well as a therapist, as a psychologist. So I have carried licensure as a therapist until, a handful of years back. I no longer maintain my license. I just let it expire because I'm retired from ministry and from therapy. But I do have decades of experience as a licensed therapist. So I understand diagnosis very well in terms of mental health issues. I also worked as a vocational minister for many years, different churches, different parts of the country. And so only one of my pieces of my education and background has been in deliverance ministry. The reason that I've chosen to do this podcast and brought my beautiful fiance along for the ride is because my beliefs say that we are in a very unique and difficult time in our culture, in our world. And that I believe that spiritual demonic attack is on the rise. And although there is a lot of messages out there about Christianity in general, I don't know if you've noticed, Baxter, but there's starting to be a wave of people like me that are talking about this subject, probably because we believe that it's been undertaught for decades and centuries. And now it's time to bring it back because many people are struggling. And so that's why this podcast is focused on this. When you do a podcast, you really should have a focus. So I didn't want it to just be, this is a Christian podcast. There's plenty of those. I wanted it to be a kind of a secret, very personal place where people who are struggling with real issues can come and get help. Not all of the people we have helped are suffering from demonic possession. Many people we've helped are struggling from some sort of maybe demonic attack or what they would consider a spiritual attack. And some people have just been wanting questions about this or that, or maybe even having questions about just life struggles. And so that's what we do here. So if there was an assumption that I'm just some minister who just thinks everything is demons, which I'd probably, let me see, just rough estimate, hear that about 400 times a week. That, all you care was about demons. And most of the time, Baxter, those are from the Christians. So anyway, I want to kind of give you that background. Now, as a mental health therapist, I just want to tell you that I had some specialties. And I really worked a lot with what they call abnormal psychology, which are the pretty severe diagnoses, personality disorders, some of, to use a layman's term, some of the heavier disorders. So abnormal psychology deals a lot with personality disorders, big issues. Let's just call it what it is. And so if somebody has a little adjustment disorder, that's a common diagnosis they give to people who want to bill their insurance for therapy, but don't really have a diagnosis. So they say they're just having an adjustment time in their life, and the insurance company will approve like 6 sessions that you can bill for free, but you're not really admitting that you have a diagnosis. That's not abnormal psychology. Abnormal psychology would be like somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder who is, very much a, kind of what would be in my days called a sociopath. And I'm going to give you like a little brief education from the old school, which I'm a little more old school than new school. They have erased the term sociopath from all these diagnostic tools, because they say that it better is termed as a psychopath. But the way we used to word it is this: the sociopath and a psychopath are different to us, because a psychopath will walk into a room and kill everybody. A sociopath will walk into the room and get everybody to kill each other. So when they kind of merge those into one, I never liked that. Now, many, many well-known psychiatrists and psychologists would argue with me, but I would wonder how much they've actually had clinical experience, or if they just studied this in school and became research psychologists. Because when you work with clientele with these heavy disorders, you know the difference. I've met people that I've walked into a room and the atmosphere changes, and I would say that that's better diagnosed as a mental illness. But my Christian friends would say, well, that's a demon. And so what we're going to do today, Baxter, is kind of walk in the mud, in the gray, because I think you want to make it black and you think I'm going to make it white, but I'm instead going to take us to the gray. And so we're going to kind of, dig into that a little bit. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask Melissa, because Melissa, in the radio terms back in the old days, they would call it your ombudsman. And what that means is they're like the person that checks you to make sure you're not saying random stuff. So, as our ombudsman, of course, my co host, I joke, but I want just to know where you land in terms of mental illness and in terms of like, what are your thoughts, and we can talk a little bit about maybe depression and stuff, but I'm talking about, do you have any experience with people in your life or people that you know that had very severe mental illness?
I wouldn't say severe mental illness, but I mean, I have a few cousins that are bipolar, and I didn't realize that there's stage 1 and stage 2 or different
Yeah.
stages of
Bipolar 1 and
bipolar.
bipolar 2. Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought it was just all one. But I just remember like growing up, I we didn't know that he was different. He was just who he was at the time. But as he got older, and I think when he joined the military is when he was diagnosed with being bipolar. And I just remember he told me one time as an adult, maybe this was maybe 10 years ago, not very long ago, that we were just talking about our childhood memories and things like that. We was talking about our parents, as always. And he just mentioned that he always felt like his mom changed towards him when she found out that he has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, versus it was almost like she was ashamed of him being diagnosed, other than him just being, I hate to say a bad person. I mean, he wasn't a bad person, just kind of making some irrational decisions, throughout his life and things like that. But I just remember him saying that really hurt his feelings, and that his mom kind of changed towards him when he was diagnosed. Now he was in the military for in the Navy for like 15 years, so it didn't affect his job or anything. But after, we talked about it, he got remarried. He was married once, and then he got married second time, and he was telling his second wife about, his diagnosis, and just so she can understand him more. And she actually bought him a couple of books about it. And she wasn't really open about learning more about, how to handle him when he would have an episode or things like that. And then, now you can correct me if this is wrong or not, but he has 3 children, and they all have either type 1 or type 2 bipolar. I'm not sure if it's more of a stronger gene from the male side or from the female side.
It's
So
more
from
it
him,
they definitely say that there's a genetic component. It doesn't really
say which
delineate
side
between a
it
male
comes,
or a female
female.
side
Yeah.
or the paternal or the maternal side, but they definitely have a genetic component to people developing a diagnosis like bipolar, which is very different than other things. But keep going, and we'll kind of
Yeah.
we're going to dig into that in a second. So
Yeah.
keep going.
So one of his daughters has maybe the type that he has, which is the 2, and the other ones have 1, bipolar 1. But other than that, I think that's the only one. I mean, I have a relative, but it not a mental illness. It was due to being bit by mosquito and contracting different type diseases that causes other mental, functions, having to learn how to walk and talk and things like that. And then the seizures cause other issues, but nothing. I remember I had a cousin, but this was back in like, remember the early 80s when people were going out to the clubs and they were spiking people's drinks and things like that with, was it PCP?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's like the one that makes you like really crazy and see things for a long time. And I just remember he went out and someone put that in his drink, and he was in his like early 20s, and I just remember it really changing him, like his personality really changed, and he would, now I don't know if he started doing other things after that or if there was a mental illness that was underwritten and no one knew about it that kind of brought that ahead, or if it was demonic. I just remember being afraid of him after, that episode happened with him. Like he would have like episodes maybe like once a month where it could be 90 degrees outside and he's outside with like a hat on and an overcoat, and was saying that he was cold and just kind of looking really, like eyes were kind of glazed over. So we just kind of stayed away from him. And then 6 months he would be fine, but it seemed like he would have like a breakdown or an episode or something like every 6 months up until his adulthood. I mean, he's in his 60s now and he's still a little, you know, I don't like being around him, but he's never done anything to me or anything like that. It's just the way his vibe is. It's just kind of just a little off a little bit.
Well, let's jump in here a little bit with a little bit of the education you said you wanted. Okay, because it'll help Baxter as well as all of those listening as well.
Okay.
Let's get a little clinical for a little bit. So there are different types of disorders that they're categorized into groups, subgroups, that type of thing.
Mhm.
And then there's also things where medical conditions can then affect mental health functioning.
Okay.
So, like a traumatic brain injury, for example, can alter somebody's personality
Mhm.
and their functioning. A severe illness where people get some sort of a virus, or they had lack of oxygen, or
Like fluid on the brain
fluid
is
on the
what,
brain, things
yeah.
like that. And so those are they're kind of classified different. Now, these things evolve, and so I'm going to give you kind of the old school and then kind of tell you what the new school has kind of changed. So let's start out with this before we get too far. There is bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and I'm going to oversimplify something that's a little more complicated than this, but for the purposes of this podcast,
Okay.
bipolar 1 is basically where you have bouts of depression that are accompanied by mania. And that's like a very heightened sense of like affect. Like
Mhm.
I always used to say, have you ever been like, one time I was at a Burger King and this guy just walks in and he's like, how's everybody doing today? And he jumped up on a table, like one of the tables in Burger King, and says, hey, it's my birthday today. Let's all sing me happy birthday. And he starts singing. He goes, all right, this side of the room and this side of the room. And I'm with a friend of mine, and they're like, what's this dude's deal? And I said, he's bipolar,
Uh-huh. Mhm.
because only manic people behave like that. They
Right.
get crazy. They go out and go like on a bender. Nobody knows where they are for 3 days,
Mhm.
and then they kind of crash. Bipolar 2 is basically what's considered hypomania. And I hate to say it's like a lighter version because it's just got its own unique challenges, but it may not be pronounced. And then you can get more complicated with if you're a rapid cycler, or if you're somebody that only has cycles of mania, every 6 months maybe.
Oh.
And so it can look different for different people. So, Baxter or anybody listening, that is a very simplified version of something that's very complicated. And let me just pause here before I go any further and say, I am not providing any medical or psychological advice today. I'm
Mhm.
giving you general concepts. Please do not take this and say, well, I heard a guy on a podcast tell me this, what this is. So now I've diagnosed
Myself.
myself or somebody else. Please seek out mental health professionals. This is just some basic education, what I would call layman's education, as it relates to Baxter's question. And so we're going to cover a lot of this today, but I am not your therapist. I'm not
Mhm.
offering therapeutic advice. Again, I don't even maintain my license. It's since expired. So I can't even give you advice if you called me and asked me for it. So, with that being said, that's a basic overview of bipolar 1. But what I want to do is say, in the old days, they had what was called a 5-axis diagnosis.
Mhm.
And now the DSM 5 kind of took out the 5th axis, but we'll kind of explain that. So, the first axis of a DSM 5 diagnosis, it basically is the fact that, like, axis 1 would consider any mental health or substance abuse disorders.
Mhm.
Okay, so these would be considered things like a bipolar would be an axis 1, because it's a mental health disorder. If you were an alcohol dependent person, because
Mhm.
there's alcohol abuse and then dependence. We all call it addiction
Right.
in the lay terms
Mhm.
in the normal world, but they actually have terms like dependent, which is an alcohol dependence. That would be considered an axis 1. Axis 2 would be all of the personality disorders, which we're going to cover a lot today. And then it would also cover things like mental retardation or, mental cognitive issues.
Okay. Yeah.
So you can't just, that's why all of us therapists always laugh and say, you can't just call somebody crazy,
Mhm.
because there is massive amount of data that would need to be figure out what axis you fall into. And just to kind of keep going here, axis 3 would be any of your medical conditions. So like, let's say you have diabetes.
Mhm.
We would include that in your diagnosis, because if we ever saw you and your affect was low, it may not be
Mhm.
from a mental health issue. It may be because your blood sugar's low.
Mhm.
And so when you're assigning a diagnosis to somebody, you don't just say, well, they have depressive disorder. You have to do an axis 5. Now it's just 4 axes, but because you have to be able to tell a clinician that's going to treat that person the whole person, not
Mhm.
just the one diagnosis, because they may have several diagnoses. Axis 4 on this term is basically notes or anything that would be environmental issues.
Mhm.
So, like one of the common things in an Axis 4 line would be like unstable housing, because that can affect how a person. So, you can say, well, this person has anxiety disorder, but you have to also say, well, could it be because they don't have a place to live?
Oh, yeah,
And so you
exactly.
might do what's called a rule out, which I'll talk about in just a second.
Mhm.
So you might say, well, let's talk about it now. So you might say in the axis 1 line, you might say rule out anxiety disorder, see,
Because it's
see axis 4,
Mhm.
because their whole life is stressful right now. It may not actually be. So you're not diagnosing the anxiety disorder, because then that's part of somebody's permanent medical record
Mhm.
if they're billing insurance. So you want to let the therapist who's going to work with that person, make that determination down the road. Because if this person's, housing situation gets better, but they still have anxiety, now you've almost reinforced that diagnosis.
Mhm.
And then what was considered Axis 5 was called a global assessment functioning score. And they took it out of the DSM-5 because they basically said that it's kind of unreliable and it was very subjective depending on the therapist who was doing an evaluation and a diagnosis of somebody. But that used to just mean that, like, if you were like 100 on the scale, that you would basically be um you would basically be pretty high functioning. And if you were down at a 40,
Mhm.
then that clinician who was going to treat you would know that you're not functioning very well. Like
Right.
we can't expect a whole lot out of you. Maybe even the lower it gets, you might not even be able to feed yourself.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how this works. And again, the DSM-5 has drastically altered this. I come from a very old school point of view. I love a lot of what they did with the DSM-5, and I
Mhm.
hate a lot of it too. And I think most older therapists would say that they struggle to make these conversions. And they've had, like, the DSM-4 then had a text revision. So if you were to go to a library and find the DSM-4, then right after it would be the DSM-4 TR,
Mhm.
because it's the text revision. And then now you go into the DSM-5 and so on and so forth. So this is kind of how a diagnosis works. Now, I say all that to say what we're really going to cover today is a couple of these big ones, like schizophrenia, like
Mhm.
dissociative identity disorder, as well as maybe an antisocial personality disorder or a narcissistic personality disorder, or maybe a schizoid or a schizotypal personality disorder. And Melissa's looking at me like, what the heck are you talking about? But these are some of the ones that maybe um, either clinicians that aren't believers or clinicians that don't want to rush to judge somebody as possessed may have one of these typical types of disorders.
Mhm.
So we'll get to that in a second. But I just kind of want to kind of just take a little pause here and say, like, this is a lot of clinical information. And again, before we go farther with our little outline here, I just want to make sure again that you do not ever self-diagnose, because that's horrible. Because those of us who went to college for this, when you first start reading your abnormal psychology books and the DSM, you have everything. Most people think that you're going to start diagnosing your
You said.
relatives. You really start looking, going, do I have that? Do I have that? And most of the time you don't. Sometimes you do. And I will also say, in fairness to non-clinician people, yes, there are a lot of people who become clinicians because they're trying to get their own therapy. And usually those people don't last very long in their
Mhm.
clinical profession, because they will eventually, it'll eventually manifest into, them making the sessions more about themselves, and
Yeah.
clients will eventually stop coming, and, or it can get worse than that. But so, that's where we kind of have to let that lie. So,
That's funny that you say that. Whenever I go to my doctor and I was like, well, I think it's this because I read that. And that's the worst. The doctors hate that because you go on like a web MD to say, okay.
it's 100 times worse
And
for a clinician.
yeah, exactly. I could only imagine. So I have a question for you. So have you ever had a mental illness and a possession, like where they both are combined, that you've experienced
Yeah, quite a few.
in being a
Good
pastor
question.
or
Good
like
question.
as a
Thanks for,
therapist? Because
yeah.
I'm assuming it could happen both or
And now that you say that, this Baxter will probably be the best way for you to get your answer.
okay.
So I have one person that I think of right off the bat. As soon as you asked that, I said, "Oh, that's why I chuckled." I have several, I mean dozens, but I I definitely think of one. I had a young lady that came to me once upon a time, and she came to the church that I worked at. And for those of you who are new listeners, several of the churches that I was associated with would allow me to see private clients in the church, in my office, almost
Mhm.
like rent me the room for $1, as long as it wasn't part of my church duties. And most of the churches that I was associated with loved that, because not all pastors are equipped to be therapists. And many
Mhm.
pastors try to be therapists and do way more damage.
Yeah.
On the same token, I will be fair and say a lot of times Christian people go to secular therapists and they always feel like something's missing. So for you to be a Christian but wanting to go to a therapist, all you would have to do is agree to see me as a private client, not associated with the church. And you
Mhm.
would have to pay me directly, and see how the church took their liability off of that. And so I had to carry my own liability insurance for my private practice, but it was still in my same office. So this young lady had gone to another pastor in the church. And after a few sessions, he came and said, "Hey, will you take this young lady and try to treat her? Um, I was trying to help her, but there's something wrong with this lady. And I don't even know what to call it."
Mhm.
I've worked with a lot of pastors that their ego gets in the way. This guy was not that. And so he said, "I've actually contacted her father, and he said he's got money. He is just actually happy that he found her, because they didn't know where she was for like 6 months,
Oh no.
and because she would like disappear."
Mhm.
So I said, "Yeah, I'll meet her." And he said, "If you sign a contract and sign a release of information, I'll do the payments. And if you can just kind of keep me updated on how she's doing, but I won't ask specifics." So when I finally called the dad, I said, "It's obvious that you've been through this before." And he goes, "You have no idea how many therapists we've gotten her to since her teens or something like that." So this young lady comes to see me, and first thing I do is have her sign all these forms. And I can tell you this with the straightest face, Baxter, and everybody who's listening, her first 30 minutes were very professional. So this woman is, I'm guessing, and my memory's pretty good, 32, 33-ish at the time,
Mhm.
and a pretty attractive, well put together lady. This was in a kind of affluent community.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like in the hood. I've worked at churches in different places, but this was a very affluent community, one of the richest counties in the nation. And she definitely fit the bill,
Mm-hmm.
which didn't make sense to me because the dad said she was disappeared to the streets for months.
Yeah.
So, you're sizing people up, just trying to figure things out before you even meet with them because you really want to help them, but you're not trying to be judgmental at the same time. But it was just a shocking when I saw her. Nails were done, makeup done, and very polite and professional, signed the forms, almost embarrassed like that I
Mm-hmm.
was telling her that I spoke with your father. I know you spoke with him too.
She's like, here I go again.
I'm
I know this process.
I'm only going to release information about your well-being. I'm not going to tell them the details of the case.
Right.
I made the release of information specific to that.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of times people will sign a release, but they'll leave it blank. I've specifically wrote it just to make her comfortable
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not going to tell your dad about the specifics of what we talk about, just about payment, because he's going to pay me,
Right.
and about your well-being. And if there's any emergencies that I think he may need to know about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just doing that in case I have to hospitalize her or something, because I had the ability to put somebody on a 72-hour hold if I needed to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm looking at this woman going, this ain't going to be necessary. Well, that was the first 30 minutes. Once the paperwork was signed, she leaned back on the couch and she pulled her knees. So her feet aren't on the floor. So picture this. She's leaning in the back of the couch, but she pulled her knees up like almost to her chin. And she's got both of her arms wrapped around her knees, and if you made a fist and put the whole of your fist under your chin,
Mm-hmm.
and she's just sitting there rocking back and forth. And I said, well, that's weird. Where's the lady that was just a 30-some-year-old woman, very well-spoken professional? And I said, so tell me a little bit about why you're here. And this very young voice came out of this woman. And I said, okay, tell me why you're nervous. She goes, because you always want to talk to me, but they don't want you to talk to me. Now, I'm a mental health professional.
Mm-hmm.
Right off the bat, and those of you who are mental health professionals who are listening, you just went like this. You just went, that might be dissociative identity disorder, what they used to call in the old days multiple personality disorder,
Mm-hmm.
because she's exhibiting a second alter,
Mm-hmm.
like an alternative personality. They call them an alter, not ALTER, not an altar like at a church, but an alter. So I said, well, why don't we'll just ask some basic questions. Tell me your name. Well, this woman on her paperwork had this very unique name. I've never seen that name before, and I've never seen it since. I will not say it here, even to give you an example,
Mm-hmm.
because it is so unique that you might be able to do a Google search and find one or two people with that name and know exactly who I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Her last name was as normal as the day is long, but the first name, I had never heard it. But that's not the name that the person sitting on the couch gave me. And so we spent the next 22 minutes of the session,
Mm-hmm.
it's about 50 minutes, sometimes we go a little longer, just talking to this person. And at the end, I said, oh, I forgot to put it on your paperwork. How old are you? And she giggled and said, I'm 7. So I said, okay, well, it's very nice of you to come in. Sorry, pulled away from the mic. It's very nice of you to come in. Thank you so much. And do you think that I can talk to the woman who signed your paperwork
Mm-hmm.
so we can finish up the session? And her head turned to the left, then turned to the right. And then that same woman who signed the paperwork was sitting on the couch. And she said, are we done? And I said, yeah. She goes, I'm so excited to come back next week.
So
And
she just basically unfolded like a transformer, like her body from being her knees up to her chest and everything just kind of
just a
just
normal, the same
normal.
woman that signed the paperwork. So, Baxter, I hope you're tuned in and I hope you're listening because this is the question you ask. So, Melissa's question is going to take us right where we need to be because any mental health professional that's listening to me right now would go, that's your rule out. Do I have enough information to say that she is dissociative identity disorder? No, not even close.
Mm-hmm.
But I know which avenue I'm going to pursue. And there's a term in the therapeutic world called differential diagnosis. And before you could diagnose somebody, you have to be able to differentially distinguish between one thing or another. Melissa and I were talking about this before the episode. If somebody says they're seeing things, I can't just say, well, that's schizophrenia. Because if somebody's been on a cocaine bender for 4 or 5 days with no sleep, they're also seeing things. So I have to rule out substance abuse. Sometimes people with severe bipolar also have delusions and audio and visual hallucinations, or
Oh.
what they call auditory and visual hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't just say that's schizophrenia, label them that, and that's not what it is. I have to differentially diagnose what it is. But I'm at least on the path at this point of DID. So even though I'm a licensed therapist, we all who practice well, and some states require this because I've worked in different states, you have to maintain a supervisor, somebody with a whole lot of experience who
Mm-hmm.
you can run cases by. They're not your therapist, but they kind of help you when you're stuck. And
Right.
sometimes your supervisor will even tell you, like, yeah, I think your own biases are showing here. So they kind of are a mentor in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So I called my supervisor and said, hey, in some of my clinical work, I worked with some DID people, but this seems a little different. And he's a Christian guy, by the way, my supervisor. So what do you think of this? And he goes, well, what do you think? And I said, well, this is maybe my bias, but when that little girl was in the room,
Mm-hmm.
my hair was standing on end. But when the other lady was in the room, I felt zero discomfort, almost to the point where I didn't believe what I had all been told of she was on the streets and stuff. And he said, well, what do you think it is, Mr. Deliverance Minister? And I said, well, do you think it's possession? He goes, I don't deal with that. It sounds to me like that's your bias. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, sometimes my gift of discernment will
Mm-hmm.
kick in, but I didn't feel any of that. I just felt weird. And I'm just wondering if it's because it was such a drastic change and her
Mm-hmm.
little squeaky voice was creepy. I didn't know.
Ah.
And he goes, well, what are you going to have to do? So you're going to have to kind of pursue. So I can make this story 10 hours. So we'll kind of cut to the chase. So I see her a handful of times, and it doesn't take long to where I've met 6 or 7 different people, different names, different ages. Um, and then I decided that from my supervisor, his name was Mike. Mike had said, well, do you have anybody in the church, like another minister, that could sit in the session with you?
Mm-hmm.
And because, you know, you even though your office has a big window and we don't keep blinds on our windows, so if anybody walks by, they can see you, but they can't see the client. You set up your office this way for accountability.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody walks by, they could tell that I was sitting in my desk in case, it just creates an accountability. So a therapist is not alone in a room with the woman, and a
Right.
minister is not alone in the room with the woman, because it's a major hallway that people walk by all the time. And we were talking earlier, Melissa, where you can't just put cameras in
Yeah,
these
that's true.
offices unless you get permission because of the confidentiality. So
Mm-hmm.
in order to record a session, you have to have the client sign that. And this woman was way too fragile to even consider that. So, but I did ask her, before you come to the session today, do you mind? I have a guy that's training and he wants to sit in a session.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, sure. Well, that ended up being great advice because we were about 20 minutes into the session, and not the youngest girl, but a girl that was probably about 10 or 11 with a different name. I asked her if she had suffered any type of abuse that she would be willing to talk about. And there's belief that DID or dissociative identity disorder happens when your personalities shatter because of a trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Usually people who have DID have suffered some sort of ritualistic abuse. And that doesn't mean satanic ritualism, although sometimes it could. It just means ritualistic means that it happened over
It's
and over
repeatedly.
again.
Yeah.
Like, so stepdad came in your room 3 nights a week and abused you,
Mm-hmm.
or dad, every time he got drunk, beat the tar out of you and all of your siblings.
Mm-hmm.
Ritualistically, almost like on cue, that will cause somebody who you just emotionally as a child can't handle that. So
Mm-hmm.
you shatter. That's the general belief system. Again, I'm making a very complicated subject
Right.
simplified for the purpose of this podcast. But when I asked her, have you ever suffered any abuse? And I don't mind cussing on the podcast, but I only do that when I'm reading letters. So I'm going to abbreviate the bad word here. But a very deep, angry voice said, "Don't F with her." Like, and so my poor pastor friend who's sitting in this chair next to me curls up in a ball. And at that point, I now was beginning to suspect that this could be demonic possession.
Mm-hmm.
And Baxter, trust me, I'm getting to your answer. Because I have this gift of discernment, which, you can't quantify with science. So let's just say I don't. But I have these suspicions internally, but now I'm suspecting other things from other conversations. So now I have a path that I'm going to go down. So I have a lot of clinical data. So now I'm going to say something to the effect of, who am I talking to right now?
Mm-hmm.
And the voice continued in the deep, gravelly voice, and it began to speak to me in the most malicious, vile ways possible. And I've been called many names, and will continue to be called names in the future because of what I do for a living. But my buddy who's in the corner, is shrunk up pretty good. And I can give a lot of details about that. I think I might even have mentioned that briefly in a previous podcast. But this woman was gone and there was something else there. And it wouldn't give me a direct name, but it kept telling me to leave her alone, and it was going to kill me and it was going to kill my children. But this is the part where I think we're going to get in the gray here, Baxter, because you might say as a non-believer that simply one of her alters had developed to be this character or this altar that was her protector. And that's what the altar kept telling me, is I'm her protector, but it wouldn't give me a name. Keep in mind, I have a list of notes in this file on my desk because I'm having to keep track of these names, because it seems like almost every session I'm getting another altar, another name.
Mm-hmm.
But this one would not give me a name. And so I say now, okay, we're going to go down another path. So pastor friend's gone. I'm back in another session a couple of weeks later, and I push some more buttons. And Baxter, this is where you're going to have to suspend your bias. And this is where maybe you've done some study, but you can't fix this problem. I guarantee it. So this, what I now suspect to be a demon,
Mm-hmm.
has started to get very personal. And I said, "What is your name, demon?" And the demon in this woman, her eyes blink, and when she opens them up, there are no pupils. I mean, there are no whites, all pupil, all black.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I know this is a demon.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you weren't there, Baxter, so you're not going to believe me, but I'm giving you this information for a reason. Then this demon proceeds to tell me about something that I did 7 years prior by myself in detail that no other human on earth knew. Something that I would have been embarrassed of, something that when I did it, it bothered me and continued to bother me. I've since learned to let it go because trust me, when this demon brought this up, it punched me in the face, metaphorically. It wounded me from shame.
Yeah.
Baxter, there is no way on God's green earth that another human soul knew that. It was something that as a Christian, God was telling me not to do. He was telling me that he was fighting me, and I recklessly and willfully disobeyed him and did it. But no other human knew. When that happens, Baxter, the scientific method is gone.
Yeah.
And why did I tell you this story this way? When Melissa asked, I just started laughing because I'm like, this is where we get to the meat and the potatoes here. I followed the scientific method. I didn't immediately say demon possession. I didn't immediately call my supervisor and say it's demon possession. And when he asked me if I thought it was, I hinted that it was a possibility. But in my mode, I had to rule out the DID first. Now, Melissa's question made me chuckle because do I believe that she also had DID? Yes. See how we're gray here, Baxter? See how we're in the gray? Because some Christians will say there's no such thing as mental health disorder. It's all demonic influence, attachments, possession. And some clinicians will say that it's all mental illness, and all you religious freaks take it to demonic possession because you're not skilled enough to handle or diagnose whatever. But I hope you hear that I'm the guy. I am not somebody who is a low-level therapist, my friend. I have a ton of education and a ton of experience. Right before the end of my career, somebody asked me in an interview how many clients I think I have saw and how many clients have I been over? Because I was in my career, I oversaw large treatment facilities when I wasn't working in full-time ministry. And while I was working in full-time ministry, I still saw clients. But even people that I supervised or people that, you know, one of my therapists, I helped them with a patient. I have helped tens of thousands of clients. So it wasn't like I saw a couple clients and then I was a pastor. If you asked me what I did with the bulk of my time in my career, it was more therapy than ministry. And so I know what I'm talking about. And hopefully you see that the scientific method was used, but it ran out. And there, I think, in lies the question of what is the difference? Well, again, Melissa's question takes us to the gray because the only real question for me is the chicken and the egg. Did the demon come in and cause her to shatter from the trauma and took her into these altars? Or did the altars occur and because of her weakened state, the demon came in and found its place within her quote unquote psyche, her soul, what I would call it.
Yeah.
And so watch this. So I proceed then over the next couple of sessions to fight with this demon. So
did the other pastor join you again?
No,
or
he
did
never came back.
Because he didn't want any of his secrets to come out.
Yeah, that's
or
100
moments. Or
that's
moments.
100% what it is.
Yeah.
If he was here to defend himself, he would say, no, it just creeped me out. No. And if you've read my books, you'll hear that I put some little excerpts in there of what a demon will do during a deliverance ministry session. If any of you here have ever been involved in deliverance or an exorcism, depending on what your faith is, even as a paranormal investigator, but you've had you've called in a priest or a pastor or a
Mhm.
demonologist, you've witnessed this. I guarantee it.
Mhm.
Because when the demon starts waning,
Yeah.
they try to get you off of your focus, out of
Mhm.
focus. And so what happens is they talk.
Mhm.
So the demons that have been messing with me for years are around, right?
Right.
And they're telling this demon, "Oh, ask him this."
Uh-huh. Gotcha.
Demons are not omniscient. They're not like God. They can't read your thoughts. They can't read your mind. They
Mhm.
don't know everything. Omniscient, meaning all knowing like God, or omnipresent, like you can be everywhere like God,
Mhm.
but they are a network. And so in this case, I'm sure the demon that was watching me do this and influenced me, that I don't blame the demon. I chose the sin, but the demon was telling me, just do it. Remember
Yeah.
those old cartoons, the devil and the
The
angel on your
angel.
shoulder? That's more
Mhm.
true than you want to believe. But except it's not the angel, it's the Holy Spirit and the
Yeah.
demon telling you, opposite directions. So
Mhm.
what happens is he never comes back, but I start fighting with this demon, and the little girl keeps trying to show up, and I'm like, this is a distraction. I don't want to talk to you right now. I want to talk with the demon.
Mhm.
And the demon wouldn't come out. So I would provoke it. And I would say, we're not going to do a session today, and I'm not going to charge your dad. We're just going to read the Bible today. And then all of a sudden, the demon, I don't want to read the Bible. And I would say, well, let's recite Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me
Mhm.
lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And I'd say evil, real,
Mhm.
like menacing,
Mhm.
and it would come to life. I'm going to kill you, holy man. I don't know why I've been called holy man by a demon like 400 times. And I laugh because I guess it's because I'm ordained, because I'm not a holy man. I guess
Yeah.
that's the term that they use,
That they
or
use.
what they've used on me. I don't know. But, it starts cussing me out. I'd kill you if I could, holy man, this type of thing. So we ended up getting a couple of ministers, and we got together, spoke with her father, and we prayed for her. And the demon, or demons, I would say, left. And she had some deliverance that day. And before I left that church, that young lady had stayed in contact. Her dad stayed in contact. She had moved back home with her father and I think it was her stepmother. They had some long talks about the mother, because from what I could diagnose, because when she stopped coming to the sessions is when she decided to move back. So we never really got into the sources of the ritualistic abuse, which we know
Mhm.
kind of occurred, but it seemed like it came from the mother. So the dad had disclosed that he had divorced the mother because she was very abusive, and probably uncovered that she was more abusive than even he thought she
Mhm.
was towards this daughter. And that mother was very kind to the other people in the family, but was very abusive towards this one, which would probably indicate that the mother was borderline personality
Mhm.
disorder, or she was demon possessed, and we would call it borderline. See how gray this gets?
They
See how
just choose
murky?
one. Yeah.
See how
I've heard
murky
of
this
that.
gets?
Mhm.
So I never really understood all of that full ritualistic abuse, but the daughter was doing great until I lost contact with them. And this is probably the early 2000s
Mhm.
when this occurred. So it's been 20 years, probably 20 plus, or at least around 20. So when I look at this question from Baxter and then from you, Melissa, you can see that I can't give you that solid answer, because I believe in this case there was a bit of both. And so I've always treated it like more chicken and the egg versus it's not one or it's not the other.
Mhm.
If you ask my opinion, I believe that most of the time we have a diagnosis of some sort. And
Mhm.
even if that diagnosis is situational, so for example, you could be diagnosed with clinical depression, but it really isn't clinical depression, it's situational depression.
Mhm.
So I'll give you an example, Baxter. There's a test that you can take. It's called the MCMI. And there's this big diagnostic test. It is not the MCMI, which most, or the MMPI, excuse me, that most people use. It is the um, MCMI. It's a lowered test. It's got less questions. But the first question says, are you depressed most of the day, nearly every day?
Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody who's depressed would have that. But it doesn't say over your lifetime. It just says, are you depressed most of the day, nearly every day? Well, guess what? If I'm situationally depressed, I would answer yes to that question. And if I continue through that test, it's going to ask me that same question several different ways. But if I take that test 6 months from now, when my situation has changed, I'm going to score lower.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just diagnose people with depression. You have to know their history, right? So here's what I'm saying, Baxter,
Yeah.
is when we get to this point where we're looking at a diagnosis, we have to say that we don't really know all of these questions to make it a solid, this is one way or this is the other. But I can tell you this, there comes a time where you have to say that science cannot answer these questions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the example I'm giving you. Not everything has to be a levitation, spin your head around,
Exactly.
throw up green pea soup to say, oh, that person's possessed.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, if somebody threw up green pea soup, you probably first thing you should do is, what did you feed them for lunch and why did they just throw up? Is the stress of this deliverance session making them throw up the soup you gave them?
Mm-hmm.
But when somebody tells you something that they should never know, what's your answer to that, Baxter? And if you don't think this has happened, don't take my word for it. You can go find people that would swear to this, not the deliverance ministers, the
Mm-hmm.
people who can show family that would say, this person was bad off. They went to this minister, they prayed these prayers, and they are great now.
Mm-hmm.
You could find that. Now, scientists or science mind people would say, well, the possession was a psychological kind of a, what would be called a placebo.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that they were delivered, so therefore they're better. Cool. How do you tell yourself this person has a 12th grade education from an inner city school and during a session starts speaking fluent Latin? How do you describe that? There's nothing in the DSM 5, 4, 3, 2, the first one, that would say that that's part of a diagnosis, because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can tell you this, I speak a few different languages, at least, conversational. And I could think of another session real quick as our time comes to an end here, of a woman that started asking me questions in Italian.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I speak enough Italian to understand what she was saying. And I definitely answered her back in Italian and then took it back to English. And we took a break. And the mother came out and said, what was she saying to you? And I actually assumed
that they all spoke.
that they all spoke that.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't even know what language that is. And I said, well, that was Italian. And she was like, there's no way she would have known Italian.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what I did is I continued to ask questions in Italian, and the girl would not answer me.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was this little season where the voice changed, all that stuff came. Now, you might say, well, she learned a little bit from a TV show. Maybe she watched The Sopranos. It wasn't that. It was conversational. It wasn't a few words. And so when you see something like that and the family can correspond with you and say, there's no way that she should have known that, that's where science has to take a back seat, Baxter. And that's what I want you to know. Why do I do what I do? I do it because I've seen too much to afford myself the ability to just blame it all on mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking to somebody who knows what he's talking about. There's a lot of things I don't. I'm not saying I'm the smartest guy in the world, but this is something I do know about.
Mm-hmm.
And, running treatment facilities where I'm dealing with severe personality disorders, you can kind of tell. You can kind of tell the difference after a while.
Mm-hmm.
Real quickly, as we wrap up, I saw a social media post or something that I think it was one of our people showed me the other day. And it said something to the effect of all narcissistic personality disorder is demonic possession. And I kind of winced a little bit, and it broke it down really good. It says, well, narcissists do this and this. They lack empathy. It gave the diagnostic criteria and kind of some of the things that especially what's called a malignant narcissist would do to you. And it kind of made a good argument. But again, you're not talking to somebody who believes that mental health disorders don't exist. I've treated countless clients with mental health therapy as the primary and some prayer, and they got better. You know, I've treated people with substance abuse issues, which I believe that addiction is a spirit, but I've treated them with clinic because these people came to me in a clinical setting where their funding came from a secular organization that I can't use religion and get paid for it. And I've treated them with that, and they've gotten better. So what happens is you're not talking to somebody who's going to discount one for the other. Right. And I would simply ask that you do the same. Now let's kind of wrap with this.
Very good. Thank you.
So I've seen levitations twice. And then kind of some, what I would call semi-levitations, where it looked like there was some floating going on, but I'm confirmed there's nothing under this person. This isn't a magic trick type thing. I've seen some of the horrible things. But one of the things that I know that what I do is real is I have watched transformations like you cannot see unless you've seen it with your own eyes. You can't picture it in your mind. I mean, when I say you can't see, I have watched people that go from violent, uncontrollable people that in one prayer session have literally become functioning, healthy people. Not with some theoretical orientation that you could read, you know, whether it's Rogerian client-centered therapy or a cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or any of the orientations that they put out there, family systems or whatever you've worked with. This is a prayer session one time and the person's better, verified by countless family members. And that person saying, I couldn't go to work. I couldn't keep a job. I have gotten in trouble with the law. And since your church prayed for me, I have a job. I have a wife. I have a kid. I am healthy. I have a bank account. I haven't beat anybody up in, 3 years. I don't get angry anymore. That's hard to dispute. Yeah. So Baxter, what I'm saying is like, as you answer your question, it's not the perception of possession. There are people that struggle with spiritual attack. And that's where I'm going to leave this, my friend, because I don't know if I'm going to convince you with one podcast. But in the diagnostic mentality, we learned, this is me being an old timer again, but we learned there's mental, physical, and spiritual health. But they didn't call it spiritual. They called it mental, physical, and emotional health. I call it spiritual because when you are emotionally well, you could call that spiritually well. I don't mean religion. Throw that word out of your mind. Have you ever felt at peace in your soul, Baxter? That's emotional health according to science. It's physical, mental, and emotional health all wrapped up into one. But that's spiritual. That's a spiritual experience because on earth, that doesn't happen very much. Melissa will tell you, my last couple of days, it's amazing. I'm not in prison for beating the tar out of people. I've had a very bad weekend, but I give it to God and I move forward. But if I'm honest and I'm human and I don't try to pretend that I'm better than anybody, I've had it rough for the last couple of days. I wasn't at peace. I wasn't having a good spiritual weekend. Let's put it that way when we recorded this. But that peace is when you have it, it's a spiritual experience. Just like when I'm not having it, it's a spiritual attack or an attack on my spiritual peace. Yeah. That's what spiritual warfare is, my friend. The only difference between you and I is I believe that there are actual entities that are causing this. And you might say that you believe it's just part of the human condition. And if you say that, if you're one of those people that just says all you have to do is just suck it up,
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wouldn't have made all the money I made and bought my kids all those nice Christmas presents over the years as a professional therapist by just telling people to suck it up. Some people need treatment. Some people need help.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're coming from. So, Melissa, did that kind of answer your question and his?
It answered a lot of questions. Very good.
Anything I didn't cover, because you're the ombudsman, we keep trying to keep these to an hour and I keep rambling, but is there anything else that you would feel that we need to cover to answer Baxter's questions?
I think you pretty much covered it all. I mean, until, we'll reply to his email and hopefully he listens and maybe listen to season 1. All
Yeah,
of your
that would be good.
educational and, season 1, the
I-
9 episodes.
And I think what Melissa's saying, Baxter, is that there may be some podcasts where it's just very much everything's a demon and there's no reason for it. God just created humans, created angels, they fell and they became demons. And we approach this very educational and very much back up what we believe, whether you believe it or not. We're not just making it up as we go. We're substantiating it. So go back and listen to season 1.
Your teachings. That's it.
Teachings.
The word I was looking for.
There you go. And, I can give you countless paranormal stories and we'll tell those in the future of this podcast. But for Baxter and the listeners who may find this podcast, hopefully this gives you an idea of kind of how these two disciplines relate. It's not always mental illness. Sometimes it's a spiritual battle. It's not always a spiritual battle. Sometimes it's mental illness. But I believe the majority of the time is they're intermingled and they're tearing a person apart. And if I can help somebody with some mental health treatment, I always did that. If I can help them with some spiritual prayers and trying to guide them to the loving grace of Jesus Christ, I did that. And many times we did both and we saw great results. And sometimes we had stories that didn't come out so great. And but we did our best. But I think for the most part, anybody who believes they're under spiritual attack, who commits to prayer, is going to find that they have better results. So we're going to conclude with that. Now, Melissa, did we bore you with too much? Was I too
no, I love
too
it.
educational there?
Nope. And I think Baxter can keep up with you.
Yeah, I think he sounds like a very smart guy too.
Yeah.
Well, that concludes our podcast for tonight. We're so grateful that you tuned in. And Baxter, we're so grateful that you wrote to us. And we hope that this helped. Definitely hope that I was just as professional in response as you were for writing in. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the kindness and the professionalism versus what we normally get. It really gives me the ability to return it in favor. And so hopefully I've at least did my best to do that. Hopefully you understand that. Again, remember, like, subscribe. If you have a friend, tell them about this podcast. If you have a story or you have a question like Baxter, or you want to just get some of your questions answered off the air, we'll still do that for you. It's not about putting people on the air. It's about helping as many people as we can. So thanks again for tuning in. We hope to see you next week, same time, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, right here on the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Freedom from the Struggle podcast. Make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, and we will see you next time.